So there is this really high probability that the absolutely worst, most destructive decision you're going to make this decade won't actually be made by you.
Right, which sounds completely crazy.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, it sounds like some sci-fi movie.
Yeah.
But it's going to be made by this hidden, locked away version of yourself that you don't even know is running the show.
And I'm so glad we're getting into this today because it sounds like the plot of a psychological thriller, like you said. But clinically speaking, it's the baseline reality for millions of men.
Wow, millions.
Oh, absolutely. We walk around believing we are the rational, conscious architects of our lives,
You're right.
but we are actually being steered by, well, the basement of our own psychology.
Think about that for a second if you're listening. How many times have you meticulously built something up? Like a career, a relationship, a really good health routine.
And then you just watch yourself inexplicably tear it down at the last minute.
Yes, exactly. And we usually just write that off as, I don't know, a lack of discipline or a momentary lapse in judgment. But what if it's actually an assassination attempt from inside the house?
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. I mean, the human mind is very much like a house. We spend all our time agonizing over the curb appeal, the paint colors, the furniture.
Stuff everyone else can see.
Exactly, the visible things. But we completely ignore the foundation. We don't ask who built the blueprint, and we absolutely refuse to acknowledge the locked door in the basement.
The door that's emanating this strange, chaotic noise.
Right. And today, we are finally opening that door.
We really are. And just to give everyone a clear overview, our mission for this deep dive today is to explore these unexamined, often avoided corners of the male psyche.
And we have some incredible source material to help us do that.
We do. We are using Connor Beaton's book, Men's Work, as our main flashlight to navigate this incredibly murky structural landscape. We're going to explore how the presence or absence of a father fundamentally drafts your psychological blueprint.
Which is such a massive piece of the puzzle.
It is. And then we're going to identify the invisible force secretly driving your self-sabotage. And finally, we're going to look at the severe, literal life or death difference between being solitary and being isolated.
And I just want to add, the raw honesty in this material is staggering. And our goal here isn't to take sides or point fingers. We're just reporting on the concepts in the book so you, the listener, can synthesize this intense material into actionable self-leadership.
I love that, actionable self-leadership.
Yeah.
So let's start with that basement. If we're talking about this hidden version of ourselves hijacking the steering wheel, what exactly are we dealing with?
Well, we are dealing with what the eminent Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung termed the shadow.
Okay, the shadow.
Yeah. In the context of men's psychology, the shadow is the psychic storehouse for absolutely everything that was deemed unacceptable during your development.
So like a repository for traits or emotions you weren't supposed to have?
Precisely. It is the repository for the urges that your parents, your teachers, or your peers told you were bad or immoral or just unacceptable.
So it's essentially the dumping ground for our worst impulses then. Like the anger, the greed, the things we know we really shouldn't do.
See, that is the common misconception, and it's where most men get stuck.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yes, the dark, destructive urges live there. But the tragedy of the shadow is that it also contains a man's unlived potential.
Unlived potential. Like what?
It contains his joy, his raw creativity, his assertiveness, and his ability to set fierce boundaries.
Wait, hold on. Why would a man lock his joy or his assertiveness in a dark basement? Those are the exact tools you need to build a successful life. That seems entirely backwards to me.
I mean, it does seem backwards, right? Until you look at it through the lens of evolutionary survival.
How so?
Well, for a child, survival equals belonging. You rely entirely on your caregivers and your tribe to keep you alive. You can't feed yourself, you can't house yourself.
Right, you're totally dependent.
Exactly. So boys learn very early on to make what the material calls the sacrifice for belonging. They will instinctively trade their authentic, vital strengths for safety and social acceptance.
Oh, I see. Meaning, if you are a naturally high-energy, fiercely competitive young boy, and you are constantly punished for it.
Yes. Like if the teacher is always telling you to sit still, stop being aggressive, be a good boy.
Your brain processes that not as a behavioral correction, but as like an existential threat.
Precisely. The young brain says, my assertiveness threatens my place in the tribe. If I am cast out of the tribe, I die.
Wow. That's intense for a kid.
It is. So the boy takes his assertiveness, his competitive fire, and he shoves it into the shadow. He literally amputates a core piece of his masculinity to buy safety.
And then he morphs into the overly accommodating, timid, nice guy because that's the character the environment rewarded.
You nailed it. But the thing is, amputating a part of your personality doesn't mean it actually disappears.
Right, it's just operating off the grid.
Operating off the grid and quietly building resentment. And the text makes a profound observation here, which is that ignored potential and ignored pain have their own intelligence.
They're not just sitting there.
No, they do not just sit dormant in the basement. They actively conspire against the conscious mind. If you refuse to integrate those repressed parts of yourself, they will literally sabotage your conscious goals to get their needs met.
That is terrifying.
The author actually points to a cultural touchstone that illustrates this perfectly. Think about the movie Fight Club.
Oh, man. That is the ultimate exploration of this. You have Edward Norton's character, the narrator.
The guy with no name.
Yeah. And he's the epitome of the domesticated, polite, repressed, modern man. He's suffering from severe insomnia. He's totally numb.
He's sleepwalking through his life.
Exactly. And he's trying to manufacture a sense of identity by buying the perfect dining set from an IKEA catalog.
Which is such a brilliant critique of the conscious ego. He has sacrificed all of his vitality for an illusion of safety. He has shoved every ounce of his aggression, his masculinity, and his desire for liberation into the shadow.
And because he refuses to acknowledge it, the shadow splits off and personifies itself as Tyler Durden, played by Brad Pitt.
Yes. And Tyler is the exact opposite of the narrator.
He's uninhibited, he's dangerous, he's completely unapologetic. Tyler doesn't care about the IKEA catalogs.
Yeah.
Tyler wants to burn the condo down.
And that is the mechanism of self-sabotage in a nutshell. Tyler Durden isn't an external villain, he is the narrator's own unlived life demanding expression.
Because the conscious mind was too terrified to quit a soul-crushing job or confront a meaningless existence.
Exactly. So the shadow took over and blew up the entire life to force a reset.
That dynamic isn't just Hollywood fiction, though.
Yeah.
The case studies in this material show men doing this exact thing in boardrooms and marriages.
They really do. Like the story of James.
Yes, James. Let's talk about him. This guy is the definition of a high-functioning executive. He is the heir apparent to his father's massively successful marketing firm.
He has everything on paper.
Everything. The beautiful wife, the kids, the flawless reputation. He has spent his entire life trying to be the perfect son and mirror his father's leadership.
And then what happens?
Completely out of the blue, James starts having a reckless affair with a female colleague. And he's not even trying to hide it well.
No, not at all.
They are hooking up in locked offices, in company bathrooms, sometimes literally minutes before James has to walk into a board meeting with his father.
Which is behavior that looks entirely psychotic from the outside. I mean, he is actively placing a stick of dynamite under his marriage, his career, and his inheritance.
So when James came in to do the work with the author, he was baffled by his own actions, right?
He was completely baffled. He felt deeply ashamed, yet he confessed that the affair provided the only real thrill he felt in his life.
So why the bathroom? Why the office? Why risk the whole kingdom?
Well, when you look at the architecture of his psychology, the answer is glaring. James had never once in his life rebelled against his father.
Oh, wow. Not once.
Never. His dad was a highly controlling, dominant figure. James's entire existence, from his college major to his career path, was orchestrated to appease his father's expectations.
He was suffocating under the weight of being the perfect son.
Exactly. So the affair wasn't even really about the colleague.
It wasn't.
Not at all. The conscious mind of James would never dare walk into his father's office and say, "I don't want your company and I'm tired of living your life." The fear of losing his father's approval was just way too great.
So his shadow bypassed the conscious mind and took the wheel.
Yes. The affair was the shadow's highly destructive method of establishing autonomy. By desecrating the father's corporate kingdom, literally in the company bathrooms, the shadow was getting its need for rebellion and independence met.
It was an unconscious attempt to dismantle a prison that James's conscious mind was too polite to walk out of.
Exactly right.
That is just, it's terrifying. Because if the shadow operates beneath our conscious awareness, how do you ever catch it?
It's tricky, but it's not impossible.
If you're James, you're just waking up one day in a burning building wondering who lit the match. What are the warning lights on the dashboard before the engine completely seizes up?
Well, the clinical indicators are actually very consistent. The material points out two primary symptoms that your shadow is preparing a hostile takeover.
Okay, what are they?
They are numbing out and what the author calls the lottery mindset.
Let's break those down. Numbing out seems obvious, right? Drinking too much, scrolling on your phone for 4 hours a night.
Right, but we usually tell ourselves we're just unwinding after a hard day.
Yeah, everybody does that.
But that's the lie of the conscious ego. The reality is that you do not numb out because you are empty. You numb out because you are overflowing
Overflowing with what?
with unprocessed psychological material. Unspoken anger at your spouse, deep resentment toward your career, grief you never dealt with.
And when that material starts bubbling up from the basement, it causes severe internal friction.
Exactly. So, a man turns to excessive alcohol, hours of pornography, or doom scrolling to anesthetize the discomfort. The numbing isn't relaxation. It is a suppression tactic to keep the basement door shut.
Wow. And what about the lottery mindset? I'm assuming that doesn't just mean buying scratch-offs at the gas station.
No, it's the psychological fantasy of consequence-free, monumental escape. The text uses the case of David to illustrate this.
Ah, David. Tell us about him.
David was a highly successful executive, but he grew up under the thumb of a deeply abusive, volatile stepfather.
That's rough.
It was, and to survive his childhood, David consumed a daily diet of what is brilliantly termed fear soup.
Fear soup. What an image.
Right. He learned to hyper-monitor his environment, suppress his own needs, and constantly contort himself to appease a tyrant.
So his foundational blueprint was essentially, if I assert myself, I will be attacked.
Yes. And he carried that exact blueprint into his corporate adult life. He was a chronic people pleaser, terrified of minor conflicts, and unable to set boundaries with his boss or his peers.
He felt like a helpless victim to everyone else's demands.
Completely. And because he was too paralyzed to make small, authentic, real-world boundaries, his shadow resorted to the lottery mindset.
Which looks like what in his daily life?
David would sit in his office and obsessively daydream about catastrophic, massive changes. He would fantasize about dramatically quitting his lucrative job, buying a one-way ticket to a beach in Thailand, and just vanishing.
Wow.
He spent hours researching these escapes. He craved a complete obliteration of his current reality because he lacked the micro-courage required to simply tell his boss, no, I can't take on that extra project.
So the daydream of escaping to a tropical island isn't wanderlust. It is a symptom of feeling entirely trapped by your own inability to speak your truth.
Exactly. The fantasy is your unlived potential screaming for air. The larger the fantasy of escape, the more profound the lack of boundaries in the reality of the present.
Okay, this brings us to a massive, unavoidable question. If the shadow is the locked basement, and these coping mechanisms are the faulty wiring of the house, we have to look at who laid the foundation.
We absolutely do.
We have to talk about the father's blueprint. Because men don't just invent these self-sabotaging patterns in a vacuum.
They do not. The father figure is the original architect of a man's internal world. And historically, mythologically, the role of the father is deeply complex.
Right.
It's built on a profound psychological paradox.
The paternal paradox.
Yes, the paternal paradox. See, the archetypal function of the mother is the nurturing nest. Unconditional love, warmth, safety.
And the father?
The archetypal function of the father is to be the bringer of order out of chaos. He provides structure, physical security, and discipline. However, his ultimate job is paradoxical.
How so?
He must provide a safe structure, but he is also the one tasked with gently yet firmly pushing the boy out of the mother's comforting nest and into the friction, risk, and danger of the external world.
He is supposed to model how to take a hit, how to fail, and how to assert oneself without becoming a tyrant.
Precisely. That is the ideal blueprint.
But that entirely assumes the architect actually shows up to the job site. What happens when the father is simply absent?
And that is where the architecture crumbles.
Because the statistics cited in the material are not just sad, they are a public health crisis. You look at the Palgrave Handbook of Male Psychology, and it draws a massive, heavy line connecting father absenteeism to skyrocketing rates of ADHD, self-harm, and sexually acting out in young boys.
The numbers are staggering.
And then there are the CDC numbers showing that males commit suicide at nearly 4 times the rate of females. The texts argue this isn't a coincidence. It is deeply tied to the trauma of an empty house.
It is an absolute epidemic of the psyche. An absent father leaves a visceral, gaping void in a boy's developing identity.
But we have to expand our definition of absent roid.
Right. Yes, we really do. It isn't just the father who abandons the family or leaves through divorce. A man can be physically sitting in the recliner every single night, but if he is emotionally checked out, constantly staring at a screen, or hiding behind 80-hour work weeks.
He is psycho-emotionally absent.
Exactly. He's a ghost haunting his own living room. And the tragedy is how the boy's brain interprets that ghost.
That is the core trauma, isn't it?
It is. A child's brain is naturally egocentric. It believes it is the center of the universe.
Right. Kids think everything is about them.
Exactly. So when a father is physically or emotionally vacant, the boy does not have the cognitive development to think, oh, my dad has unresolved trauma and poor emotional regulation.
He can't intellectualize it.
No, instead the boy's brain internalizes the absence as a personal indictment. The boy concludes, there must be something inherently flawed, unlovable, or inadequate about me that caused him to disconnect.
Wow. He assumes the debt of the father's failure.
He internalizes it as his own shadow material. And this manifests in incredibly destructive ways, perhaps none more devastating than the phenomenon of the surrogate partner.
Oh, this part of the book is heavy. Let's look at the case study of Colin from the text.
This story is just brutal.
It really is. Colin is 6 years old. He wakes up in the middle of the night, hears crying, and comes downstairs in his pajamas. His dad is standing by the door with a suitcase.
A nightmare scenario for a kid.
And the dad kneels down, looks his 6-year-old son in the eye, and says, I'm moving out. I want you to take good care of your mom. You're the man of the house now.
You're the man of the house now. It is a phrase woven into our cultural fabric, often meant to instill a sense of bravery.
Right, we hear it in movies all the time.
But psychologically, when delivered to a child in the wake of abandonment, it is a curse.
Because it sets an impossible standard.
It tasks a child with the emotional and often practical responsibilities of a grown man. Colin took those words as an absolute mandate for his survival.
So what did his childhood look like?
Throughout his childhood, he acted as his mother's emotional confidant. He mediated disputes between his siblings. He tried to manage the household anxiety. He completely sacrificed his right to be a reckless, carefree, dependent child.
And you fast forward to Colin at 43 years old. He's married. He's got kids of his own. But his internal landscape is a war zone.
He is deeply depressed, easily enraged, and profoundly resentful of his wife.
Why? Because he is unconsciously grieving a childhood he was never allowed to have. He has spent nearly 40 years running the exhausting program of carrying an impossible burden that wasn't his to carry.
The boy inside Colin is screaming for a break, but the adult Colin only knows how to perform the role of the overburdened savior.
Which perfectly illustrates the rule formulated by the psychologist John Bradshaw, which is central to this work. Pass it back or pass it on.
Such a powerful concept.
Meaning you either unpack the baggage your parents handed you or you blindly hand it to your kids.
Exactly. You either gain conscious awareness of the pain, the anger, and the dysfunction you inherited from your father's blueprint, allowing you to sovereignty choose a new path. That's passing it back.
Right.
Or you remain ignorant of it, the shadow takes the wheel, and you unconsciously repeat the exact same trauma on your partner and your children. That is passing it on.
The author shares a brilliant personal reflection on this. He talks about growing up with a tale of two completely different fathers.
His biological dad and his stepdad.
Yeah, his biological dad was incredibly docile, conflict avoidant, and heavily suppressed his anger. He almost never raised his voice. Then his parents split, and a stepfather enters the picture.
And the stepdad is the polar opposite.
Completely. Highly volatile, a short fuse, explosive rage.
And what happens to a boy caught between those two models?
He internalizes a false binary. The author genuinely believed that as a man, your relationship with anger only had two settings. You either completely bury it and become a doormat, or you turn into a raging, violent tyrant.
He had absolutely no blueprint for healthy, assertive, controlled anger.
None at all.
And this is the exact trap that keeps men ensnared in generational cycles. When men begin examining their father's blueprint, they typically fall into one of two predictable, extreme patterns: repeating or opposing.
Repeating makes sense. Your dad was an alcoholic who yelled, so you become an alcoholic who yells.
Exactly.
But opposing feels like it should be the solution.
It feels like the solution, but it is actually just a different flavor of bondage. Let's say your father was a hypercritical, domineering tyrant. You endure the damage of his reign and you vow, I will never, ever be like him.
So you swing the pendulum to the absolute opposite extreme.
You become entirely passive, highly accommodating, and overly nice. You refuse to ever raise your voice or state a firm demand.
But by doing that, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You are amputating your own capacity for healthy aggression.
Yes. You become a pushover at work, and your romantic relationships lose all polarity because you refuse to stand your ground.
You think you are free of your father, but your father is still entirely dictating your behavior. He is still the architect of your house. You just decided to paint the walls a different color.
Exactly. You are defining yourself solely by what you are not, rather than discovering who you actually are.
Wait, hold on. If I'm listening to this, a massive red flag is going up for me right now.
Okay, what is it?
If we spend all this time dissecting what our dads did wrong, aren't we just handing ourselves a massive excuse? Isn't this the ultimate victim trap?
I hear what you're saying.
Like, sorry I couldn't hold down that job, or sorry I cheated on you, my dad didn't hug me enough in 1994. It feels like trying to drive a car on the highway while exclusively staring in the rearview mirror.
That is a brilliant and necessary challenge, and it's the most common resistance men have to this deep psychological work. They confuse an objective audit with an abdication of responsibility.
So what's the difference? Because they sound pretty similar.
Well, blame is the language of the victim. Blame says, the blueprint is flawed, therefore I am not responsible if the house collapses. That is a surrender of agency.
Okay, so what is the audit then?
What this material demands is an objective, ruthless audit of the blueprint. You are not staring in the rearview mirror to crash the car. You are pulling over to look at the map to understand exactly how you ended up in a ditch.
Oh, that makes sense.
You cannot chart a course to a new destination until you accurately map your starting coordinates. By looking clearly at your father's limitations, his pain, and the coping mechanisms he handed you, you stop being a victim to unconscious patterns.
You gain the power to say, this is the code I was given. I am responsible for rewriting it.
Yes, that distinction changes everything. It's not about pointing fingers, it's about gaining the administrative rights to your own brain.
But that leads to a massive practical problem. If your dad left a void, or if you are stuck in that endless loop of opposing or repeating a flawed blueprint, how do you fix a foundation while you're actively living in the house?
It is a profound challenge.
The answer the text provides is almost mythological. It says you have to learn to father yourself.
And to capture the psychological weight of what that actually means, the author draws on a vital myth from Norse tradition, the trial of Odin.
The Allfather.
Yes, the pinnacle of the masculine archetype.
Oh.
The seeker of truth, the sovereign, the master of wisdom. But the myth reveals that Odin did not achieve this mastery by birthright.
How did he get it?
To obtain the ultimate, universe-altering wisdom of the runes, Odin had to orchestrate his own brutal initiation. He went to the World Tree, Yggdrasil, he voluntarily hung himself from its branches by his feet, and he pierced his own side with his spear.
That is intense.
And he hung there, bleeding, staring down into the dark, chaotic waters of the Well of Erd for 9 days and 9 nights.
Teetering on the absolute edge of insanity and death. And the crucial detail of the myth is that he strictly forbade any of the other gods from coming to his aid. He had to endure the suffering completely alone.
Precisely. And eventually, through that agonizing trial, the runes revealed themselves to him, granting him sovereignty over his own destiny.
Now, obviously, we are not advocating for physical self-harm here.
No, of course not. We are extracting the psychological gold from the myth. Odin represents the ultimate act of self-fathering. He willingly sacrificed his lower self, his need for comfort, his ego, his avoidance of pain, to his higher self.
He didn't wait for a mentor to save him.
No, he initiated himself into manhood through chosen hardship.
So translating that to the modern man, what is the spear? What is the tree?
That's the real question.
Fathering yourself means voluntarily sacrificing your Peter Pan tendencies. It is taking the lazy, unmotivated, excuse-making, porn-watching, victim-playing version of yourself and sacrificing him to the elder, highly competent version of yourself that you are trying to become.
It is the daily, grueling willingness to endure the discomfort of discipline. Fathering yourself means you act as the benevolent but unyielding patriarch to your own impulses.
What does that look like day to day?
It is the micro-initiations. Waking up at 5 a.m. when the alarm goes off instead of hitting snooze. Having the terrifyingly honest conversation with your spouse instead of withdrawing into passive aggression.
Choosing to go to the gym when your lower self demands the couch and a beer.
Exactly. You are systematically overriding the boy's relentless desire for immediate comfort with the man's deep need for long-term competence.
And there is a very literal parenting the inner boy aspect to this work that is deeply moving. The author shares this incredibly vulnerable moment in the book.
The photograph.
Yes, the photograph. He finds a photo of himself at 5 years old. In the picture, He's taking a bath in a giant metal cooking pot out on the back deck, completely covered in dirt, sporting this huge, innocent, gap-toothed grin.
It's such a sweet image.
And he is staring at this photo as an adult man at a time when his life was in absolute ruins. His relationships destroyed by chronic lying and cheating, and he is hit with this devastating wave of grief.
Because of what he realized.
Exactly. He realizes that the man he became was not a man that little boy in the pot could ever trust, respect, or look up to.
That is a profound moment of psychological integration. Because the stark reality of the human psyche is this. If you do not actively step up to father that inner boy,
Yeah.
if you do not provide him with the discipline, the unwavering boundaries, and the deep compassion that he lacked from his actual father, that scared, unmet boy remains in the driver's seat of your adult life.
So you literally have a 5-year-old trying to manage a mortgage, run a marriage, and navigate corporate politics.
Exactly. And how does a 5-year-old handle stress? A boy throws a tantrum when his wife disagrees with him. A boy hides and lies when he makes a financial mistake because he's terrified of getting in trouble.
A boy constantly manipulates the women around him to extract the motherly validation he craves.
You've got it.
Yeah.
Until you step in and parent your own psychology, you will continuously act out the unhealed wounds of your childhood while wearing a business suit.
But when a man realizes that a boy is at the wheel, the immediate instinctual response is almost universally shame.
Yes, shame is the first reaction.
And what does a boy in shame do? He hides. He isolates himself, which pulls us right into the most dangerous territory of a man's life, the fundamental difference between solitude and isolation.
This distinction is arguably the single most vital survival skill a man can develop. The text references a brilliant framing by clinical psychologist Henry Cloud.
What does he say?
He states, "Solitude replenishes, isolation diminishes. One is connected and one isn't."
Let's clearly define the boundaries here. Solitude is a deliberate, highly intentional act. It's the guy waking up early to sit in silence with a cup of coffee, or taking a solo hike in the mountains, or spending a few hours in the garage restoring a motorcycle.
Right. He is stepping away from the noise of the tribe to consciously connect with himself, with nature, or with his higher purpose.
He returns from solitude back to his family feeling grounded, recharged, and more capable of giving.
Solitude is an expansion of the self. Isolation, conversely, is a violent contraction. Isolation is a withdrawal driven entirely by fear, shame, or a desire to punish.
And this introduces a psychological formula in the text that dictates male behavior, the law of isolation.
The law simply states that isolation fundamentally equals amplification.
Amplification. Walk us through the mechanics of that. Why does being alone make things louder?
Because human beings are fundamentally social primates. Our nervous systems regulate through connection. When a man physically or emotionally cuts himself off from his community, his friends, or his partner, he removes all the external grounding forces that keep his psychology stable.
Without a trusted mirror to reflect reality back to him, he enters a massive echo chamber.
Exactly. Whatever negative emotional state he brought into that isolation will rapidly metastasize and amplify.
So if he goes into his cave feeling a little bit anxious about a work project,
it amplifies into paralyzing, catastrophic panic. If he goes in feeling mildly depressed or self-critical, it amplifies into clinical despair and suicidal ideation. If he takes a secretive habit like pornography or gambling into isolation, the shame amplifies it from a bad habit into a life-destroying addiction. Isolation acts as a greenhouse for a man's worst shadow behaviors.
And the really tragic part is that men usually isolate for one of two deeply ingrained reasons: protection or punishment.
Yes.
Once again, this tracks straight back to the childhood blueprint. There's a case study about a guy named Craig. When Craig was a kid, if he ever stepped out of line or upset his dad, his father wouldn't yell. Instead, his dad would give him the silent treatment for a week.
Just completely ignoring him.
Yeah, he would sit in his chair, watching TV, acting like Craig didn't even exist, as a psychological torture used as a punishment. So what does adult Craig do when he gets into an argument with his wife?
He isolates.
He goes into the guest room, locks the door, and gives her the silent treatment for days. He weaponizes withdrawal to punish her.
He is wielding isolation as a sword.
Exactly. And then you have the other side of the coin with Eric. When Eric made a mistake as a kid, his well-meaning but anxious single mother would lock him in his bedroom for hours, telling him it was for his protection.
Setting up a completely different association.
Right. So adult Eric, when he goes through a brutal breakup or faces a massive failure at work, what does he do? He ghosted his friends for a month. He locks himself in his apartment, plays video games for 14 hours a day, and smokes weed to numb out.
He uses isolation as a shield to protect himself from the pain of vulnerability.
But whether it is used as a sword or a shield, isolation always ends up being the man's own psychological tomb. To survive this, a man must confront and actively break what the author terms the one rule of men.
And this rule is the silent killer. The one rule of men is the unspoken, universally understood societal mandate. Never talk about your struggle. Never show the chink in your armor. Suck it up, carry the rock, and deal with it alone.
The author shares a story about breaking this rule that honestly gave me chills. He had hit absolute rock bottom. He is literally living out of his Pontiac G5 in a Walmart parking lot in the dead of winter.
Truly the lowest point.
His entire life has evaporated because of his chronic lying and infidelity. He is showering at a cheap gym, eating fast food, and drowning in a level of shame that is suffocating him. He is the definition of isolated.
And then he makes a decision.
Finally, in a moment of sheer desperation, he decides to break the rule. He calls up one of his closest friends, a guy he had spent countless hours drinking scotch and debating philosophy with. They meet at a diner, and the author just vomits the truth.
He lays it all out there.
He lays out the absolute wreckage of his life, fully bracing himself for the friend to judge him, mock him, or walk away.
But the reaction of the friend is the twist that makes this so illustrative of the male experience. What happens?
The friend doesn't judge him at all. Instead, the friend takes a deep breath, looks around, and confesses that he, too, has been hiding a colossal secret. He admits that he has been suffering from crippling invisible depression, and that just a few weeks prior, he had survived a suicide attempt by hanging.
This is a staggering revelation about the reality of male friendship. It highlights the pervasive danger of what the material calls depthless friendships.
Depthless friendships.
Yes. Here were two men who considered themselves to be best friends. They knew each other's favorite sports teams, their political views, their preferred scotch, but they did not know each other's souls.
They were both quietly dying in complete silence, sitting right across from each other, because neither of them possessed the courage to break the mandate of male stoicism.
It's a terrifying thought. You could be playing golf with a guy every weekend who is literally fighting for his life, and you'd never know.
The absolute necessity here is that true brotherhood, real survival, requires breaking that silence. You have to risk the judgment. You have to articulate the shame to another man, because shame operates like a fungus. It only grows in the dark.
It does. The second you drag it into the light of a trusted community, it shrivels and dies.
That is the alchemy of shared vulnerability. But we have to ask a deeper question here. When a man is trapped in that isolation, in that echo chamber, the loudest voice he hears isn't the voice of his friend.
No, it's not.
It is his own inner critic. It is the voice telling him he is a failure, a fraud, and unworthy of love. We have mapped how the father builds the structure of the house, but we now have to look at where that specific, insidious voice comes from.
We have to examine the mother's imprint, the concept of the anima, and the final boss of self-sabotage.
This is where things get incredibly nuanced. If the father is the architect of the external boundaries, the mother seems to be the architect of the internal dialogue.
That is an excellent way to frame it. Jung introduced the concept of the anima, which is the personification of all feminine psychological tendencies within a man's unconscious mind.
So what does that include?
The anima encompasses a man's capacity for deep feeling, his intuition, his empathy, and his relationship to his own inner life. Universally, a man's relationship with his anima is fundamentally drafted by his primary foundational experience of the feminine, his mother.
So how our mother interacts with a boy literally builds the operating system for how he will eventually talk to himself. Let's look at Chase's story.
Yes, Chase.
Chase is a guy who grew up with an intensely overbearing mother. She was highly anxious and used heavy, suffocating guilt to enmesh Chase, making him her surrogate, emotional caretaker.
It's so damaging.
Even as a 41-year-old married executive, he is constantly fielding panicked calls from his mother, forced to manage her emotional crises. And because he was raised in an environment saturated with criticism and emotional manipulation, Chase developed a hypercritical, utterly vicious inner dialogue. He could not give himself an ounce of grace.
What is fascinating and terrifying about Chase's inner critic is its exact texture and tone. The inner critic is frequently the shadow of the feminine.
How is it different from the father's shadow?
When a father's shadow attacks, it is usually overt, loud, and physically aggressive. But the mother's shadow, the anima shadow, does not use physical force. It uses psychological warfare.
Wow.
It uses guilt, withdrawal of affection, and surgical emotional manipulation to control the man from the inside out. Chase had unconsciously downloaded his mother's overbearing, demanding voice and installed it as his own internal narrator. His inner critic was his mother's anxiety haunting him.
And this leads to an incredibly profound insight in the book, a huge aha moment. The material argues that the way a man treats and views the actual women in his life is a direct, undeniable reflection of how he treats his own internal feminine qualities.
His own compassion, his own intuition, his own emotions. It is the psychological mechanism of projection. Because men are so frequently severed from their own internal emotional landscape, they project what they desperately lack or what they deeply fear onto their romantic partners.
The case study of Sean nails this dynamic perfectly. Sean comes in complaining nonstop about his girlfriend. He says she's too combative, too emotional, and obnoxiously assertive.
He's constantly trying to manage her behavior, viewing her as this chaotic force.
But when the author actually digs into Sean's psychology, the massive irony is revealed. Sean is incredibly passive. He avoids conflict at all costs. At work, he lets people walk all over him. In his life, he acts like a child shirking responsibility. He isn't actually angry at his girlfriend for being assertive.
Not at all. Sean is projecting his own immense shame about his passivity onto her. He is utterly terrified of his own dormant anger and his own need for directness, which are locked in his shadow.
So when he sees his girlfriend embodying healthy assertiveness, his shadow recoils.
Exactly. He labels her strength as combativeness to justify his own weakness.
His relationship was just a giant mirror reflecting his own amputated traits. Instead of sitting around plotting how to fix his girlfriend, he needed to ask the terrifying question, what is her behavior revealing about the exact traits I lack?
He needed to integrate his own assertiveness so he wouldn't be deeply threatened by hers.
But doing that requires massive accountability, and the shadow has one final, ultimate defense mechanism to prevent a man from ever taking that accountability.
Yes, the final boss of the male psyche, the victim mentality.
The victim. It is the voice that is constantly whispering in your ear that the game is rigged. It tells you that your boss hates you for no reason, your wife is impossible to please no matter what you do, the economy is entirely designed to crush you, and therefore you are completely helpless. Why is the victim mentality so insidious?
Because it is a highly evolved, brilliantly effective, maladaptive coping mechanism designed to keep the ego perfectly safe.
Safe from what?
As long as you genuinely believe that life is simply happening to you and that every failure is entirely someone else's fault, you never have to face the excruciating terror of changing yourself.
You outsource your power to the external world to avoid the heavy burden of accountability.
The text uses a stark, chilling phrase to describe this. I lie, therefore I am nothing.
I lie, therefore I am nothing. That is heavy.
It is the truth of the victim. When you play the victim, you are fundamentally lying to yourself about your own agency. You are denying your ability to impact your environment.
And every time you tell that lie, you dissolve a piece of your core identity and your self-respect. You become a ghost in your own life.
It's a comfortable prison. You get to sit in the cell, complain about the warden, and harvest sympathy from anyone who will listen, but you never have to do the terrifying work of breaking out and surviving in the wild.
Which brings us to a critical cultural friction point. Modern society looks at all these men isolated, trapped in victimhood, disconnected from their anima. And society confidently declares we have the cure. Men just need to be more vulnerable.
Right, that's the buzzword.
But the source material throws a massive caution flag on that popular advice. It argues that for men, this demand for raw vulnerability is often a devastating trap.
It is what psychologists call a double bind, a situation where you are damned if you do and damned if you don't. The culture tells men to open up, but the reality of how that is received is vastly different.
This makes me think of the Charles Bukowski poem referenced in the text. Bukowski writes about the bluebird in his heart that desperately wants to get out, but he's too tough for him.
Yes, that poem.
He says he pours whiskey on him and takes cigarette drags over him and tells the bluebird to stay hidden so nobody can see him. It's this haunting symbol of the fiercely repressed emotional life of the modern man.
And modern therapy culture says, let the bluebird out, cry, collapse, be totally vulnerable with your partner. But what happens when men actually do this?
Yeah, what happens?
What happens when a man who has never processed his emotions suddenly opens the floodgates and bleeds out emotionally in front of his wife?
Usually absolute disaster. They are met with panic, anger, or a sudden visceral loss of romantic attraction from their partners. And then the man feels incredibly betrayed because he did exactly what society told him to do.
We must examine the evolutionary and psychological reality behind that contradiction. The truth is that society, the tribe, and often intimate partners still fundamentally rely on masculine energy to be a stabilizing force.
The unshakable bedrock in a crisis.
Exactly. When a woman asks a man to be vulnerable, she is not asking him to disintegrate. She is unconsciously testing his emotional stability.
She wants to know that he is in touch with his internal landscape, that he is not a robot.
But she emphatically does not want him to be consumed or controlled by his chaos. If vulnerability simply looks like a man collapsing into a puddle of unmanaged, weeping anxiety or unmitigated explosive rage, it signals a deep biological danger to the tribe.
It signals that the protector cannot even protect himself from his own mind, let alone handle the pressures of the external world. So men are caught in a brutal crossfire. If we stay walled off and stoic, we die of isolation, turn to addictions, and our partners leave us for being emotionally unavailable. If we completely collapse and vomit our unprocessed trauma onto our partners, we lose their respect, trigger their anxiety, and they leave us for being unstable. So what is the actual way out of the maze?
The way out is abandoning the culturally watered-down concept of vulnerability and striving instead for what the text calls emotional sovereignty.
Emotional sovereignty. What does that actually look like in the nervous system of a man?
Emotional sovereignty is the antidote to both stoic repression and chaotic collapse. A sovereign king knows exactly what is happening in his kingdom, but he is not overthrown by it.
Okay, so practically speaking.
It means a man is in direct, visceral contact with his emotions. When he feels rage, grief, or deep shame, he feels it physically in his body. He doesn't numb it with alcohol.
Right.
He understands its historical origin. He can track that rage back to his father's blueprint or that shame back to his mother's inner critic. He knows exactly what the emotion is attempting to teach him.
That sounds like a lot of work.
It is, but, and this is the razor's edge distinction,
Yeah.
he absolutely does not let the raw emotion dictate his reactions or his behavior. He responds with conscious agency rather than reacting defensively.
Hold on, I need to stop you there, because if I am listening to this, I am exhausted just thinking about it. Are men supposed to just achieve this Zen-like, sovereign emotional mastery entirely by themselves?
I see where you're going with this.
Are we supposed to just sit alone in a cave, stoically processing our childhood traumas and tracking our neurochemistry until we emerge as perfect, unbothered kings? Because that just sounds like the law of isolation dressed up in fancy therapy language.
That is a phenomenal catch, and it leads to the ultimate synthesis of this entire framework. You cannot achieve sovereignty in a vacuum. A king always has a council.
The council.
Yes, the fatal flaw of the modern man is trying to process his shadow alone.
The council. We're talking about brotherhood.
Yes, you must find other men who are actively dedicated to their own psychological work, who will listen to your deepest, darkest shame without panicking or trying to fix it.
Men who will call out your victim mentality, hold you ruthlessly accountable, and challenge you to embody your potential.
Exactly. You take the raw, chaotic ore of your unprocessed emotions to your brothers. You refine it in the fires of the council.
So that way, when you finally go to your life or your intimate partner, you aren't bleeding all over her. You are sharing your processed reality.
Yes.
You can say, I am feeling a massive amount of anxiety and fear today, and I know it's triggering my childhood stuff, but I have a handle on it. You are communicating your truth from a grounded place of strength, rather than dumping your unmanaged chaos onto her and demanding she act as your therapist and mother.
Precisely. You share your vulnerability from a place of emotional sovereignty, which deepens intimacy rather than destroying it.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a staggering amount of ground today. Let's tie this entire house metaphor together. We started by looking at the foundation, realizing that the presence or absence of our fathers drafted our initial psychological blueprints, and we learned how to audit that blueprint without falling into the trap of blame.
We open the basement door and look the shadow in the eye.
Understanding that our self-sabotage, our affairs, our addictions, our numbing out is just our unlived potential desperately trying to break free. We explored the life-saving difference between retreating into replenishing solitude versus falling into the toxic, amplifying echo chamber of isolation.
And we identified the mother's imprint in the vicious inner critic and dismantled the ultimate defense mechanism, the victim.
And finally, we replaced the dangerous trap of raw vulnerability with the pursuit of emotional sovereignty, supported by a council of trusted men.
An insight without execution is merely entertainment. So the direct challenge for every man listening to this today is to take one concrete action this week to break the one rule of men. Find your counsel.
It doesn't need to be a formal men's group right away.
No, not at all. Find one man in your life whom you genuinely respect. Reach out, sit down with him over a coffee or a beer, and share one hidden struggle you have been carrying alone.
Step out of the devastating amplification of isolation and into the healing reality of connection.
Drag the shame into the light.
Share the shame to kill the shame. I think that is the most powerful mandate a man can take on. As we finally wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one last lingering thought about that house we've been exploring.
A great way to end.
We have spent an hour talking about the terrifying things hiding in the basement. The worst coping mechanisms, the ancestral anger, the deep fears of inadequacy. But remember what we established at the very beginning. The shadow isn't just a container for your darkness.
No, it's not.
It is the vault holding your amputated light. So if you finally stopped isolating, if you finally dropped the victim narrative, took ownership of the deed to the house, and bravely walked down those stairs into the dark, what dormant superpower, what fierce joy, what masterpiece of your life is waiting in the basement to finally be claimed?